All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, dear teachers, dear colleagues. My name is Yulia Chorna. I'm the marketing specialist at Great Education Center from Kyiv, Ukraine. And with us today is the beautiful and amazing speaker of this webinar, Mariam Kezemova.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Hello, Mariam. It's nice to see you too. I've only seen you online actually, and we always meet online with you, but that's okay. All right. Before we actually start, let's greet the participants and let's find out where they are watching us from. So please type, if you can hear us and if you can see us well, type the place where you are watching us from. Turkey, Zaporizhia, Ternopil, wow, great. Kyiv, Vinnytsia, nice. Brovary, Khmelnytskyi, Prague. Okay, it's turning to be the international event again, and it's really nice that we have so many teachers from different countries. Zhytomyr, Kherson, Britain, Scotland, wow. That's really nice. That's really great. That's really cool. All right. When I was preparing for this webinar, actually, I read your blurb about what this session is going to be about, and I remember the situation when I started teaching my IT students, and all of the books that were actually published by that moment, they were already old and not relevant to what they wanted to learn. So Mariam is going to share her experience and her practical tips on how to use authentic materials to make your students really care about learning. And that's actually the topic of our today's webinar. And before we start, I would like to remind you that this session is going to be recorded, and you will get the follow-up email. And of course, you will get your certificates in that follow-up email, and hopefully some materials from Mariam as well. In order to get it, please check your spam folder, because these emails usually get there. So I'm giving the floor to Mariam. I'm sure this is going to be a very fruitful and wonderful session. And I will return to you at the end of the session. And thank you very much for watching us.
Yulia, thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. Guys, I am happy to see you all here. And let's begin. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can all see a little presentation that I've prepared for you guys. Right. So there we go. A little bit about why I decided to take this topic, because, well, first of all, it's my personal interest. I have always loved reading and listening to us myself when I was a student at university, at school, and I was always plaguing my English teacher about reading books in the original and listening to songs in the original and translating them. And it was a whole topic that I dedicated a part of my life to in the past, and I'm still dedicating this part of my life to these topics in the present. Why the authentic materials, right? So this is going to be a combination of how we can use reading and listening tasks in general, how we can make them for our students based on authentic materials. Now, why I have gathered you here today, if I'm allowed to say so, is because, as Yulia mentioned previously, sometimes it's difficult to find relevant materials in our textbooks. Most of the textbooks that we teach from right now were either published in 2015, 2014, which is not that far away. It seems like it's not that far away, but it was actually almost 10 years ago, right? So obviously there are much more relevant materials right now, and you are going to see screenshots and photos of these sources in the presentation here today. So let's start a bit with reading, and then we're going to switch to the listening part. Now, So how do I spark up my students' interest in reading and listening? Now, first of all, in order to understand what we teach, we need to understand why we are teaching it, right? So we all read in our native language, documents, articles, we sit on our phones pretty much every day. And if you have social media, you have read posts in different languages. Reading is an essential part of our daily routine. In order to understand and learn another language, we need to be able to read all sorts of texts written in it as well. So teaching reading is a complicated process because it involves development of various crucial skills, which we're going to look at next. So reading can be divided, teaching reading and in general reading can be divided into two categories, two types. There's extensive reading and then there's intensive reading. Now, obviously, extent is something wider, something bigger. Intense is something smaller, something more, well, something more intensive, right? So extensive reading at an appropriate level is one of the best exercises that your students can do in their own free time. Extensive reading is books, it is huge scientific works. It is something that is big in volume, right? And it includes that the more this comprehensible input, right? Comprehension is understanding. So the more the person reads, the more they will understand the language. And even if they start off with something quite small, the more they read, the bigger text they will be able to get through, the more words they will understand, the more grammar will sound more familiar to them. So it is the best way to achieve true fluency, although the definitions of true fluency are different for everyone. Now, intensive reading, on the other hand, is what we have in our classes. Now, we cannot teach extensive reading in our classes, right? Because otherwise they would last 5-6 hours, if not more. So we teach intensive reading. Intensive reading is done in class with the help of shorter texts or shorter excerpts of longer texts. So if you take an excerpt from a book, which a whole book would be extensive reading, but an excerpt would be intensive reading, that's going to be considered the second type. Reading intensively means reading a text and completing several exercises, activities based on this text. And these activities usually train different skills, such as reading for gist or reading for specific information. So let's look at what these skills mean. Oh, yeah, one of my pictures didn't load in here. Right. So let's take a look at the activating skills. I'm going to show you a bit later the example of this exercise. Now, before reading, before activation, before we do the exercises, before we actually start teaching the skills, we need to activate our students' interest in the text, in the topic. Now, let's switch this back before you guys have read everything. Could you please type into the chat for me in one sentence how you usually activate your students' interest in a reading task? I want to read your suggestions. Okay, brainstorming, pre-text questions, intro, visual, simple topics, words, phrases from the text. Okay, prediction questions. Great, these are all great and absolutely correct answers. Related topics, main idea of the text, headlines and discuss, okay. Okay, so you've got an idea about what activation is. That's great. To read with some emotions, descriptions of the pictures, vivid pictures, discussing. Okay, pictures, figurating, all of this, which is absolutely great, of course. Right, so let's take a look at what we can suggest in here. Now, pretty much everything that is on this slide, you guys have mentioned in the chat already. Now, activation helps give our students a chance to think about what they're going to read before we actually throw them into the reading task. Now, we get our students to be prepared to dive deeper into the genre and topic of the text. Now, what kind of task can we use with this? We give questions about a text and ask the students to guess what they will find in it. I mean, in the text, of course. We can show the students pictures which accompany the text, or headlines, captions, like you already mentioned, and get them to guess what will be in the text. We can display part of a text and ask the students to predict what comes next. They read the next section afterwards to confirm their predictions. Now, in order to do this, though, you would have to separate a part of the text before students see the whole thing. So if you're in an online classroom, you would show something on your screen before sending your students the materials, and they would look at the text before they look at the whole paragraph. They would work in breakout rooms or in pairs and groups, try to predict what comes next. And then when they go back to the main room, you would discuss and share, they would discuss and share their opinions with each other. Now, we can also give our students short phrases or words from the text and ask them to guess what the text will be about. They can also put these phrases in the order that they think they will appear in the text afterwards. It can be something as simple as you might take the main events out of a text. Let's say it is an article about the abduction of a little girl in a small village. You saw this in a newspaper, you decided to make a reading task out of it, right? This happens, unfortunately, all the time, of course, and you can make use of it. You might separate the main events into chunks. If you're in an offline classroom, that would work even better because you could cut them up into small pieces of paper, hand them out to students and get them to work in groups when they jumble everything, try to put it back together. First of all, great physical activity. They would get their hands working, they would get their heads working. Second of all, great teamwork, a team building activity as well, because they would be talking to each other and discussing this. And then they, of course, read the text and check if they guessed everything correctly. Right, now that gets me to the next type of skill that I would like to talk about. Now, these are different examples of further reading tasks. I won't tell you which ones just yet. I would like you to type into the chat which skill or skills you think these kind of exercises test. Take your time. In one sentence, you can type your suggestions into the chat. Got the first answer here, reading for gist. Matching. Matching is more of a type of an exercise, but what does it test though? Reading and speaking. Okay, lexical. Read through. Understanding. Okay. Understanding. Matching, again, type of exercise. Comprehension. Specific information. Scanning. If you've got more ideas, type them in. Finding text, skimming. Okay. Summary making. Reading for details, looking for specific info. True, false, special questions, understanding the main idea. Inference, great. Okay, so let's take a look at what it actually is. All of these exercise examples are testing this skill or developing this skill. And it is reading for gist. Now, reading for gist includes skimming and scanning, other sub-skills. Let's talk about gist in general. Now, what is gist? It is the understanding of the text on the whole. So this is a wider thing. Now, when we also have reading for specific information or for detail, this is not this. This is reading for general comprehension. So if you typed into the chat comprehension, understanding, main idea, you are completely correct here. It is the reading for gist. So one of the main reading skills, reading for gist, what does it mean, right? The task will give our students to teach the skill, develop their ability to get a general understanding of any text. It doesn't have to be some fictional text. It doesn't have to be an excerpt from a book. It can be a document. For example, you're given a legal documentation, or maybe you're given a scientific article. You still need to get the main idea out of it. So what kind of tasks can we design for it? Now, first of all, students read the text and tell each other if they liked it and why, or what they agreed and disagreed with. How we can organize it is they can do this by themselves first, and then be either in pairs or groups. If you're teaching online in breakout rooms, if you're teaching offline, they just discuss it in the classroom. This will engage them emotionally with the text and make them think about the meaning of what they have read about. Now, what sort of tasks are suitable for this, right? So this activity will make them think emotionally about the text or get attached to the text, which in turn will make them understand the meaning a bit more. The text, you can also present the text in a puzzle, right? This works excellent in offline groups as well as online groups. When you're teaching online, it's going to be a little bit more maybe challenging technically, because you would need to separate the text into chunks, cut them up if you're offline, or cut them up if you're online as well on your device. And then make students arrange these parts in the order that they remember from the text. So do you remember, you would ask them, do you remember what the order of events was in the text? And mind us, they only read the text once, so they might not remember everything. This is why we're talking about the gist and not specific information. Now, at higher levels, we can use multiple choice tasks to test the students' understanding of the text. Type into the chat, please, guys, if you have ever made multiple choice tasks by yourselves. So created your own multiple choice tasks. A simple yes or no will be great. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see yeses and pluses. That's great. Okay. Now, what have you found the most difficult when you're creating multiple choice tasks? Type it into the chat in one sentence, or a couple of words. That would even be great. And I'll share mine with you as well. Distractors, make a fake answer, make up the right question. Rephrasing, 3 wrong variants, distractions, yeah. Asking the right question. Create alternative variants, different options so they can be confused. Yes, exactly. We aim as teachers, sometimes my students say that my purpose in life is to make their life difficult, which is not true, but you know, I do it for their own good. More than one correct option? Well, I can say that I definitely share your difficulties here. Oh, I share your difficulties there, and I have the same problem from time to time, creating distractions. What we can do in multiple choice tasks is we need to remember, right, especially if we're working with reading about abstract things, reading a book that's deep fiction, that's talking about deep things, is we need to make our choices in the multiple choice questions as not as obvious as we usually would make them. So of course it all depends on the level of your students, but the higher the level of your students, the more difficult the multiple choice tasks need to be. Now, you have to remember that with this, you need to pick up certain differences in the text, certain nuances, right? And your choices don't have to be, not just don't have to be, they must not be obvious. Otherwise, you're not developing the skill of your student, the skill that you want to develop, right? So as a teacher, and when you're preparing for the lesson, what I do is I make sure that I read through the text at least twice, if not 5 times. Plus, if you're taking an excerpt from a book, like a chapter or a page from a book or a paragraph, don't just take this paragraph out of context and not read anything else. You have to make sure that you remember that you have read what comes before and what comes after, so that you may predict anything that might happen after the excerpt that you present to your students and what happened before you presented it to your students. Right, that's multiple choice. Let's take a look at the next exercise. Now, this is an exercise that we use with reading as well. This is from my own worksheet. I created this task. I won't tell you yet which book that was, but which skill do you think this exercise can develop? Type the letter of the correct answer into our chat. Okay, I like your way of thinking. Yeah, this one is pretty obvious. Okay. Another question I have for you is, when in the reading lesson do you think this exercise might occur? At the beginning, the middle, or the end? Follow up, the end. Yes, that's right. Yep, absolutely correct, the end. It might be in the middle if you're more working on the creative side of your students, but it's usually towards the end. So that leads me to the next question. Developing creativity of your students. This is why authentic materials are so important. Texts are a pure form of creativity, obviously. Not just fictional pieces. Think about articles in magazines, newspapers. Of course, it takes skill, writing skill, to write any piece. But it also takes the creativity to put together words and sentences to engage the reader. And when you're reading a piece of writing, you are automatically engaging in the creativity, right? Pictures spring up in your mind. You start imagining yourself in the same situation. So you're trying to understand what the person or the characters are feeling in the excerpt that you're reading. So one way to engage your students in a deeper processing of a text is to ask them to refashion it. For example, by transferring it to a different genre or perspective, sometimes even a different point of view. for instance, from the eyes of a different character in the story. That's what I did in the previous slide, right? I asked the students to rewrite this paragraph where the character talks about their favorite season, right? I asked them to rewrite it as if they are the main character of the story and they are writing in the book, they are composing the story. This will spark up their creativity. So it would make them writers even for 5 minutes. Another way to do this is you may ask your students to write a continuation to a text, maybe an alternative continuation to a text. Let's say you gave them a small chapter from a book and you didn't give them the ending to the chapter, or you gave them several options of the ending. You might ask them to think how they might change the ending, or think about an alternative ending, or just write a continuation if you haven't given the options to them. So they must be aware of the main ideas, key features of the original input, the tone, the style, the characters, the storyline. So we have done exercises for gist, we have done the activation beforehand. We've probably done reading for specific information as well. So after having done all that, of course, now we may get to the bigger part of this. This may also develop their writing skills. So you would be combining a reading lesson plus a writing lesson. Now, let's talk about where we can get the materials for all of this. Now, you can't see my room. I can't show it to you, it's a bit messy, but I have about 300 books around me right now. And it is true, I'm not lying to you, I promise. Pretty much all of them are in English because I have collected them for years. And I know a bit about books in general, so I can show you where to find them or what to do with them. Now, books are a great source of reading material, obviously. This doesn't have to be explained. But our students are either tired of cliches of the reading world or too scared to read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens or the 1984 by George Orwell, because these are the classics, right? The classics are a whole different thing. And as teachers and human beings, of course, we need to constantly develop and keep up with the modern tendencies. This also concerns reading tendencies. They change from year to year and from month to month, actually. One of the best ways to find and share book knowledge and interests is a social website for books. So it is social media for books. That's called Goodreads. Have you ever heard of this? Could you type your answer into the chat, please? Okay, I hear yes and no. Okay, great. Now, if you do have Goodreads or if you have heard about it, you could go and secretly find me there after this webinar and see my reading history. So this is where you will find lists and lists of books to anyone's liking. Fiction, non-fiction, women's literature, literature written by English authors, by American authors. I will show you an example of what it looks like in a minute. So that's Goodreads. This is where you can share with your friends what you have read. This is where you can update your personal library. Now, that's books. Let's leave them for now. If you're looking for shorter texts and something a bit more to the nonfiction side, that's going to be articles and news. Now, you're going to be like, well, this is obvious, Miriam. Why are you telling us about this? Articles and news also happen to be in textbooks. But are they new? Not usually, right? Unless you've got a textbook that's been published in 2020 2022, after one war started, after the pandemic began, after multiple major things happened in the world. Unless you have that, you don't have relevant, newest information on your hands. Where can you find it? You can find it online, of course. Online newspapers, online magazines. You can get subscriptions to those. They are usually not that expensive, either not that expensive or even free, right, to some magazines. I'm going to show you a couple of examples in a minute. Now, let's look at Goodreads and what it looks like. This is an example of what a Goodreads list looks like. Now, since this is Women's History Month right now, the March, and yesterday we had International Women's Day, I decided to show you this list, right? You can find it afterwards. You will have the presentation. You can go and look for it. This is the suggestion that Goodreads made for me a couple of days ago. 96 nonfiction books to read this Women's History Month. Now, 96 books. Imagine the amount of material you can take from this. And this is only nonfiction. The amount of fiction you will find on Goodreads, the recommendations from 2023, from 2022, from the previous years, anything to anyone's liking. Now, I'm going to show you my personal favorites and things that I have used in my materials. Now, those who studied with me, they will definitely remember this book because I talk about it all the time. It's my favorite book by V. Schwab. It's called The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. If you have the chance to read it, I highly recommend it to you. Now, this is fiction. This is historical fantasy. And my students' responses have been amazing from this. You have to be interested in a book. You have to love the book to make exercises out of it, to make worksheets out of it. If you don't like it, no matter how hard you try, you don't have to be an excellent teacher to make reading materials. I mean, you have to strive to be an excellent teacher, but you don't have to be. If you like the book, if you love it, if you are fascinated by it, the words will just flow out of you, right? So you have to be fascinated with the book. You have to have read it. Another example of this one is The Ninth Child by Sally Magnuson. This is also history. My students have found it very difficult. So this is more for higher levels. But this is a good example. These have all been published in the last 2 to 1 year. So these are all very recent. Now, the thing that you see here in the middle is what a Goodreads page looks like. This is what mine looks like right now. This is what I'm reading. I'm reading the Storyland, the Mythology of Britain right now, and this fictional book. This is what you will see when you create your own account and start reading. Now, a bit about articles and newspapers. I have 3 subscriptions where I take reading materials from all the time. The Times, this is not free. I think you have to pay like £1 for it for a whole year. So £1 a year and you've got the subscription to the Times. Unlimited access to millions and millions of articles on different topics. Then if you are interested in fashion or culture connected with fashion, celebrities, that's going to be Vogue. The subscription is free. You just have to register on their account. So you just type in Vogue. There are different Vogues out there. There's the British Vogue, there's the American Vogue, there's the French Vogue, etc. And whichever one you like most, that's going to be your source of material. And then there's also The Guardian. Obviously, not everyone's cup of tea because they lie sometimes, but who doesn't lie in the newspapers nowadays, right? The Guardian is a great source of political news as well. Not just political, but also small things like abductions of pets or disappearances of toothbrushes in people's houses. This is what you can find in The Guardian. You have to have an account on the website, but you don't have to pay anything for it. So out of these 3, only The Times is paid subscription. Right. Do you guys have any questions? Type them into our chat. Okay, what can I use for technical students? The Guardian is good for technical students. Although you would need to get Goodreads and find lists of technical literature in there. That would be your best bet there. And Goodreads is free. Vogue is free, The Guardian is free, and I think the Sunday Times is free as well. Yeah. Okay. So far, I see no other questions. Let's get to the next topic. So we've talked about reading. Now I've got another question. Digital text in order to improve reading. What do you mean by digital text? If you mean social media posts, then sometimes, yes. But pretty much all of them are either written incorrectly or with grammatical mistakes. And although it can be a great example of spoken language, it might not be the best alternative to teaching reading, as in actual understanding of the text. Okay, guys, let's get to the next slide. Now, we've talked about reading, but my question to you is, and type this into the chat if you agree, do you think that we can use the same types of tasks for listening that we used for reading? I get a nope, I get a plus. Not always, some of them, okay. Okay, the most that I agree with is that some yes, some no. In general, yes, we can use the majority of them interchangeably. Of course, since these are two different skills, that's reading and that's listening, some exercises are not applicable to listening that are applicable to reading. So let's take a look at them. Now, close this. So reading and listening are similar in such a way that extensive and intensive also exists in listening, just like it exists in reading. Intensive listening is when students listen to audio tracks or a live speaker during the class. So they are listening to them with the aim of doing some exercises, doing some activities. That's going to be intensive listening. It's also shorter in time. Extensive listening, just like extensive reading, is used in students' free time because it takes a longer time. This is when students listen to something outside the classroom, often by themselves and for pleasure. Although it's difficult to kind of force your students to listen to something for pleasure because they're too scared to do this. How not to make them scared? Let's take a look at the next slide. This is one of the exercises I designed for a YouTube video for my students. You'll see a lot of familiar, maybe actors' names in here. That's from a video. What skill in listening do you think this exercise is testing? Type it into the chat. Pay attention, there are numbers here and names. That's specific information. Yes, you are right. That's specific information or detail, we can say, right? You're confused because this is taken out of context. This was a video about different avatar actors talking about how many minutes they can hold their breath for. We watched this together with my students after we watched the film. So we were all obsessed with Avatar at the point, and we thought that we could make something out of it. So we listened to the interview. Now, let's take a look what other kinds of tasks you can design for specific listening. Now, listening for detail, or listening for specific information is after having an activation task, an exercise for gist, finally comes the time to torture your students. That's what my students refer to this like this. This is listening for detail. This is where you get to have fun with creating different ways to test your students' abilities. First of all, what you saw in the previous slide is times, dates, and numbers. Many listening passages are full of them. This is the perfect opportunity to ask our students to note them down and explain their significance, for example. Now, you can also create a multiple matching exercise to match a number to its meaning, like in the previous slide. A story told twice. This is an interesting thing, but you have to do the double work for this one. Now, a story told twice is more for live speakers than it is for pre-recorded listening passages. This is the kind of activity that gets your students to spot the difference, which is kind of difficult. I mean, not kind of, it's difficult because they have to be concentrated all the time. That takes them to spot the difference between two stories. So it's pretty much the same story. You read it twice, but with several changes the second time. This is where you activate your students' specific thinking. Alternatively, you can use this transcript of the story, of the listening text, to create a fill the gaps exercise. There are two ways you can do this. A more simple way and a more difficult way. So obviously for maybe weaker classes, for stronger classes. For weaker students, for students of lower levels, you can make a box of phrases and words, pre-teach them beforehand, pronounce them, train the pronunciation, drill them together, and then re-listen to the story, to the listening together, and get them to fill the gaps with the words and phrases from the box. Now, if the students are of a higher level, if you have a C1, C2 group, then you get to make their lives a bit more difficult with this. Now, this is going to be a bit more realistic because in reality, when you're listening to a live speaker, you don't get to ask them one more time, oh, could you tell us what that word you said in paragraph 2 minutes ago was, because I didn't catch it, right? So the second option is you just give them the gap text, you tell them how many words or maybe one word they need to put into each gap, and you get them to listen one more time so that they can fill the gaps. Right, that's listening for detail. Let's take a look at another example here. This is one more type of exercise with listening. Which stage of a listening lesson do you think this task is? Type your answer into the chat. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's going to be the end. All right. Yep, that's a final discussion. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. That's right. This is again from my own worksheet. We listened to a podcast with my students during one of our listening clubs, and then we discussed all of this at the end. This is another, well, technically not a skill, but a type of exercise that you can use to develop a skill. Discussing is important, obviously, right? Why are you stating the obvious? This is speaking. How is it related to listening? Now, engaging input is the listening that you give your students, means engage students. a vital factor for learning to occur. If your students are not engaged, they will not learn anything. Any extended listening passage that is not purely functional in nature, by purely functional, I mean ordering food at the restaurant, calling a receptionist to get an appointment with a doctor. So any extended listening passage that's not functional should be interesting enough to inspire at least some sort of comment or debate even, or round up to a discussion afterwards. This brings us to the notion of personalization. Most students feel motivated to listen because they see their own ideas or situations reflected in the input and hear views that confirm or challenge their own views. So how can we as teachers create our own post-listening discussions? There are 4 ways that I'm going to talk about. There are more, of course, but these are the main 4 that I use in my own practice. First of all, you can personalize. You can ask if your students have been in similar situations or experiences. You can even ask what they would do in the same situation that was mentioned in the listening passage. You could also ask questions. You could personalize questions. Devise a number of questions based on the topic of the listening passage. Ask your students what they learned after the task and what their conclusions about the task are. Now, you can also do the same, but with statements. This is more of a true-false exercise. Devise a number of statements based on the listening passage and ask your students to discuss whether they agree or disagree with the statements, whether they think they are true or false based on what they listened to. And then one more way, and this is the most interesting one personally for me, is sorting lists. This is where you get to put in a bit more work than usual. You create a list of points or aspects based on the listening passage, and you ask your students to rank them in the order of the importance personal to the students. Let's, for example, give this, imagine this. You have listened to, not an article, but let's say a speech of some president or politician about why we should ban cars from the city center, right? Now, there are a number of reasons mentioned for this in the speech, right? There's maybe environmental reasons, there's reasons that people have more accidents in the center of the city, people are stuck in traffic jams, and this is bad for time management. And then you get your students to rank which of these problems they think are more, not important, but severe in their own way. So for some student, it might be the environmental reasons, right? They're on the first place. For some students, it might be the time management and they hate the traffic jams. All of these are personal, and they get your students talking about their own experience. Right. Do you guys have any questions before we move on? See nothing so far. Okay, now let's get to where to find listening materials, the most interesting part. Just like with reading, it is always important to stay on top of what's popular in the world of listening in order to stay relevant to our students' needs and interests. Well, this is an obvious statement, of course. What I use and what I am fascinated by, I discovered this about 2 years ago, I think, is podcasts and interviews. I love interviews on YouTube. I even got myself a YouTube Premium to listen without advertisements because I hate when they interrupt someone's speech. You don't have to get that, of course. It's just, just my own thing. But you can use YouTube all the time when you're doing this. So podcasts and short videos, usually interviews. I'm going to drop a couple of suggestions later on this. It is of the utmost importance that our students are able to recognize and understand natural speech with a variety of accents and at different speed. my students hate, okay, I'm going to ask you this before I tell you my opinion on this. Which accent is the most difficult for your students to understand when they're listening to it? I mean, American, English, Australian. Oh, I see Aussie already. Yeah. British. Okay. British, Irish. Okay. American. All right. Cockney is difficult to understand even for the natives. So Scottish. Yes, they do speak with a bit of a lilt. Okay. My students hate Scottish and Australian the most, but they love, you know what they love? They love Liverpool accent. It's just so hilarious for them. They die of laughter every time. It's just, yeah, interesting for them. So let's take a look at the suggestions of where you can take materials from. I am dropping the suggestions of my favorite podcasts nowadays. You can listen to them on different platforms. These are excerpts from, I took these screenshots from Spotify. Now, these are also available on Apple Podcasts. These are also available on their own websites. They have their own websites. And they are also available, most of them are available on YouTube for free. Yeah, now, most of them require either a subscription or, you know, like Apple Podcast. I think Apple Podcast is free, right? But Spotify requires a subscription. There's that. But they have such a huge variety of podcasts that you can never get through them in one lifetime. So this is what I highly recommend. Now, The Last of Us, I'm obsessed with the show. The Rotten Mango is, oh gosh, what is it called? It's a criminal podcast. Very good, very interesting. And How to Protect the Ocean is for those who want to talk about the environment with their students more, like I do. I had this question from Natada, right? What if most podcasts are too long and it's only possible to play once? You take excerpts out of podcasts. This is what I do. I divide them into chunks like I would do with reading. And I then give excerpts of them to my students. This is what I can't listen to the whole podcast with them because they're usually like an hour long, right? Okay, these are podcasts. Now, one more thing is YouTube. These are my favorite. I love these shows. Now, there's BuzzFeed Celeb. These are interviews with celebrities. And then there's my favorite Jimmy Fallon, who also does a late night show with different celebrities. There's one more, and I'm going to type this into the chat because I forgot to mention this in the presentation. It's called, you guys probably have heard about this one. It's the interview that's called Hot Ones. This is where an interviewer takes a celebrity, interviews them while they're eating hot wings, spicy wings. And he kind of tests their ability to eat spicy food and talk at the same time. There's that. Right. Do you guys have any questions before we move on to our final stage? You're welcome, guys. Great, great. I'm not stingy, I can share. All right, I see no questions so far. If you guys have those questions, you can drop them into the chat while I'm talking, and I'm going to answer them at the end if we have enough time. So, storytelling. Storytelling is a multi-billion, well, we have proven today that storytelling is a multi-billion-dollar business. Books, films, series, podcasts, even music, that's all storytelling. All of these things have become detrimental to our development as society. So stories hold absolute power, whether they're read, seen, listened to. The majority of material we teach is either based off of stories or can be further used in one, in their own writing, in their own speaking. So why do we use stories in class? Right. Ignore the Latin, the random Latin, I forgot to remove it. Now, stories create interest, first of all. This is why we tell stories. Interest is one of the main things that drive the humanity to knowledge. Stories have been told for centuries, or even for millennia, I think, right? If we take the prehistoric people as well. And it has always been one of the main ways of how knowledge has been passed from one generation to another one, right? Stories also create a structure for remembering course materials, grammar, vocabulary. Stories connect concepts and events, which in our head are associated with each other, and this is how we remember them. Stories create personal bonds. Sharing your personal experiences with students creates stronger rapport, which is highly important in a class, especially with teenagers. It doesn't only concern adults, but especially with teenagers. You have to have this connection to them, which leads to a positive learning climate. They learn more. The more students connect to you, the more you learn with them. Now, how to make your storytelling effective. And this is when you can use your own words and your own stories as listening practice in your class. It needs to be well structured, first of all. You need to make sure that you design something of a plan, the opening lines, introduction, main part, culmination, conclusion, all the parts that a good story usually has. You can divide your story into logical, time-stamped chunks, especially if it's long. Don't be afraid to use humor. Now, you don't have to be a stand-up comedian to do this, right? No one appreciates that. That's a bit too much. It is scientific, though, that humans react to and memorize something they have either heard of before or experienced themselves. Humor makes the story feel less serious, and therefore it will be listened to not as a compulsory task that I have to do, but as a form of entertainment, and not an obligatory lecture, of course. And then there's also proper intonation. This is very important. This is especially important when you're designing stories for listening in classroom. Since lots of exercises in the future for higher levels of language knowledge require students to identify correct answers based on the emotions shown in the story. How does the speaker feel? Are they sad? Are they happy? Are they excited? And this in turn is an invaluable and absolutely essential life skill for your students, identifying human emotions through a speaker's tone. Right, I'm going to read through our chat very quickly. Curiosity, interesting way to grab people's attentions. Yeah, humor does make it easier. Although you can't be too much with humor, right? Otherwise, the lesson will turn into, oh, I have a joke, or oh, I have a joke as well. And then you're all going to be laughing and not learning anything. Good speaking practice, but nothing much more. Now, guys, this is time for questions. If you had any, drop them into the chat. I'll try to answer them as best as I can in the 2 minutes that we have. Okay, see nothing so far. For lower levels, YouTube. I used to have this list of YouTubers who are doing listening exercises for lower levels. There's Lucy, English with Lucy. I'm going to type this into the chat so that you guys can have it. English with Lucy is very good for this. It is very practical. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you. Nice, nice. Thank you for the kind words. How to motivate them? You have to be motivated yourself. If you're not interested in listening and reading, your students will not be interested as well. They have to feel your excitement, because this all comes from you, right? You're a teacher, you're inspiring them. So if my students see that I'm obsessed with a book, I will get them to be obsessed with a book as well, because it's quite easy, actually. Mm-hmm. Thank you, guys. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you coming to listen to me today. Yula, I guess this is your time to shine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mariam. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for sharing your love for the language and for the books. I'm really inspired by your session. And thank you for sharing the resources, which are very important, free, and teachers can use them with their students. Yeah, I would like, maybe we have some more questions in the chat box. I will check it, yeah? But I would like to remind our participants some important information, all right? So we actually, I've already said that you will get your certificates tomorrow. We will send the follow-up email together with the materials and the recording of this event. And don't forget to check your spam folder when you get it right. And if you don't find the email, you can go to the video library on Grade University platform for English teachers. You can scan the QR code, and Mariam's session and the other sessions by great teachers is going to be there, so you can watch it anytime for free. One more event that we are running this month is going to be the online workshop by Lydia Simak, and we are going to talk about how to prepare students for B1 and B2 level exams, and we will be talking about how to improve their writing skills on this event, right? And also, if you like this webinar, I'm sure you like it because we received so many nice words from you. Don't be lazy and go to our Facebook page, which is Great Teacher Training. I'm going to share the link in the chat box as well. And please leave the review about today's event. And this is very important for us because we want to improve. We want to share more with you. We are interested in what you are interested in, actually, and we want to create more wonderful sessions and professional opportunities for English teachers. So I'm looking forward to seeing your reviews of today's webinar there. And thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope to see you at our upcoming events. Yeah, let's check if we have any more questions. Let's stay for a couple of minutes. Maybe someone will ask us something. And yeah, thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, guys. All right. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your feedback with us. We are really happy. And I forgot to say to Mariam, congratulations on your debut. This is the first time for her to perform in front of such a huge audience. Yeah, and it's a brilliant work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yula. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I will stop the recording now.